In talking about the app, I want to give a little bit of context because one of the most uncomfortable aspects of founding a community is the role of enforcement and selection. Because it's not fun to say you're good for the community, you're not good for the community. It's not fun to say, you missed your dishwashing chore yesterday, you missed it the day before, you missed it the day before, and then listen to a long list of excuses, and then have to say, well, you've got to do this or you've got to do this, and then you didn't do that. And it's basically a power dynamic that is created by vertical roles that have been a part of almost every cult in history, the role of enforcement. And one of the dynamics in this kind of enforcement cycle is not getting the big picture. So some of the rules can be rigid. There's also the element of one person, let's say they do a lot of extracurricular activity, or they actually break a rule for some reason that's more important, but it doesn't show up. Then you have, if someone breaks the rule for a reason that's really important, but that doesn't show up and isn't measured, and someone else breaks the rule because they're lazy, but then says, well, so-and-so broke the rule, but it's not a visible dynamic. Now, a lot of this dissolves simply by keeping a small group, because if you have 150 people or less, you're actually going to see and know a lot of what's going on. But if the community prototype is going to be iterated and shared in various places, in a country and in the world, I think it's important to have a framework that doesn't wear down the personal relationships and people in the community, a framework which can be an app that tracks patterns over time. Now, certainly there will be politics involved as, quote, friends ask each other to lie, to distort the data in order to, quote, beat the system. However, that is highly destructive if the system is in fact well built. And so this app is something that can reveal relevant, useful patterns that have never been available to any group of people before. Patterns of energy consumption, patterns of warmth and empathy versus sociopathic distance, patterns of growth and patterns of deteriorating responsiveness and intelligence. An app like this can reveal patterns and can allow communication instantly between one person and the entire community, which again is something that's never really been available in that way. To hear a piece of news that brings you to your knees and you're curled up in a fetal position in a small sleeping quarters, but you're able to press an alert button and let everyone know that this is a level 5 crisis in your world, number one, but just as importantly, the protocols for how to support you and how not to invade and overwhelm you at this time. And finally, problem solved. I've got the support that I need. Everyone else can let go. And this type of dynamic is simply not available anywhere in the world that I've seen. So it's a powerful technology because it can record the successes and failures of any group that's using it. it can track the important metrics in any group so that they can be discussed and dealt with. And it can allow things to be looked at as metadata and as personal data, as impersonal data, such that, for example, if the entire community has an increase of boredom, over the last 6 months, boredom has increased from 2% to 4% within the community. Well, that's a 50% increase in boredom. And so then the question can be, what are the systemic variables that can be edited to go back to 2% boredom rather than, continue in another 6 months to 6% or 8% boredom. So these types of things are incredibly useful. They allow sociologists and other forms of social scientists to measure the impact of community protocols. They allow for comparisons between 100 people, the rate of depression, for example, within the community versus the larger community, the rates of suicide, the rates of sexual abuse. All of these things as metadata can be captured and at that scale can be responded to within the community. So it's a very powerful tool. And, from personal experience growing up in communities that had very long, boring, consensus-oriented meetings, well, I think this and I think that, and what about this, just to decide the most basic things. An app that weights decisions by competency. So if it's an architectural decision and you are the architect and you are rated highly by the members of the community in your architectural competency, it is reasonable that perhaps you alone get 50% of the vote for an architectural decision, and then the remainder of the vote, or maybe you get 48%, and then the remainder of the vote comes from members in the community. And if you are a chef deciding how cool you have to keep the meat in the community to avoid bacteria, well, if you are a competent chef rated and high in competency, you may get 70% of the vote, just by being competent in that area. And the decisions can be made quickly in a variety of locations by the people who actually care about them and recorded, so that conversations can be there and members can listen and catch up at a later date. So these are key ways to facilitate flow and information. And so, I think a key thing is personal profiles, the development of roles so that anyone who's competent can choose a role, get good at the role, and be voted on for their competence, not their character, but their competence to play a given role. If you take on the baking role and 70% of people, can't stand eating your bread, you're not very fit for that role. With that feedback, you can either get good at making bread or relinquish the role through a series of automated filters. If you're not making headway and the majority of people are dissatisfied with your role, then you're automatically removed. And it's not someone saying, I've got to remove you. You set a standard within the app framework. And then you're really competing with yourself to participate and create a 10x living situation. Cash flow, again, it's important to understand for everyone. If 20% of the community's cash flow is going down and down and down, then that can show up as an alert of something to discuss. How are we going to restore the influx of cash coming into the community? Contribution and measuring the different mental, emotional, physical, and financial forms of contribution is also very important because it helps avoid, the pattern where, less than 20% of the people will, do most of the taking and the least of the giving. These types of things can be highlighted automatically just through the metadata and data, gathered throughout the community. So there's a tremendous power in app technology of this type, and I encourage you to read through, the app in a lot more detail. I consider it to be as valuable potentially as 50%. In other words, I think that whether or not a community works or doesn't work, that question may depend 50% on the quality and use of an app that is designed to highlight and bring to everyone's attention the variables that are important in a 10x living community.